The storm had rolled in from the mountains without warning, a gray tide spilling over the ridges and pouring down into the valley, until the world was nothing but white and whispering air. The trees bent low under the weight, their branches heavy, and bowed like mourners over a grave beneath them. The forest floor was lost, no scent, no track, no heartbeat remained in the open spaces where life had moved only yesterday. Everything was buried under cold silence, a silence so thick it pressed against the skin and made even breathing feel like trespass. The pack had sought shelter where the cliffs broke into hollow stone, their den hidden deep under roots and rock. They had weathered many storms before, but this one had come hungry. It swallowed light, it swallowed sound, it swallowed hope. The Alpha stood at the mouth of the den, ears forward, eyes cutting through the white haze that devoured the trees. He listened, he waited. The wind screamed across the valley like something alive, but there were no answering calls. The cubs had been missing since dawn. The mothers paced behind him, their bodies tense and low tails pressed to the frozen earth. Every few moments one of them would whine, a sound too small to fit the size of the grief clawing at their chests. The others would answer, soft, broken, almost human in its ache. They had searched when the snow first began falling. They had followed the faint trails leading down toward the river, but the river had turned to glass, and the trail had vanished beneath it. No scent remained, no warmth, no sound of small paws stumbling through powder. Only emptiness and the endless voice of the storm. The Alpha turned once more to the horizon. His breath came out in bursts of white steam. He did not understand how something so small, so new, could disappear so completely. The world was supposed to guard its young, but the world had grown cold and cruel and silent. He let out a low growl that rose into a long, deep howl that carried over the treason was torn apart by the wind. The sound came back to him shredded and hollow inside the den. The others pressed close together, seeking heat that did not come. Snow crept through the cracks and melted on their fur, only to freeze again. The Alpha paced the entrance restless. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper a name he could not remember. He lowered his head to the ground and breathed deep, but found nothing. No trace of life, no promise of return. The night stretched thin and endless around him, and still the snow fell. It fell until the forest lost its shape, until the mountains themselves seemed to fade. The pack huddled in the dark beneath the world they once knew, waiting for dawn, waiting for a miracle, waiting for a sound that would mean their cubs were still alive. The storm had quieted by morning, but the silence it left behind was worse than its roar. The world outside had frozen into stillness. The trees stood like white statues, and even the air seemed to hang suspended, waiting for something that would not come. The pack emerged one by one from the mouth of the den, their paws sinking into the crusted snow. Their fur clung together in matted clumps. Their ribs showed where the wind had stolen warmth. Hunger lived in their bellies, but grief lived deeper. They moved in slow circles around the den, noses, low tails, dragging eyes sharp and unfocused. They searched again for scent, for sign, for any whisper of their missing young. The mothers called out with soft whimpers, their voices breaking against the still air. The others answered, though they knew no echo would return. The Alpha watched from the ridge above, his breath rising like smoke from a dying fire. He had not slept since the cubs vanished. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his eyes were fierce and unwilling to close down. In the hollow where the snow had drifted deep, one of the wolves began to dig. Her claws tore through the ice, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. The others joined her there, movements wild and frantic. Snow and dirt flew into the air until the hollow was torn open like a wound. But beneath it there was nothing, no warmth, no sound, no promise, only the frozen bones of roots and stones that had never cared for the living. The wolves stopped digging and stood still, their chests heaving, their faces streaked with frost. The Alpha descended from the ridge and walked among them, his steps slow, heavy, deliberate. He touched each of them with his muzzle, brushed against their shoulders as though his strength could be shared through contact. He did not speak. Wolves did not need words. The air between them was thick with understanding and pain. They had lost part of themselves, something they could not replace nor forget. The snow began to fall again, light and thin like ash from a dying fire. The pack gathered near the den once more, curling together in a great circle of fur and bone and quiet despair. Their bodies pressed close for warmth, but the cold seemed to live inside them now, not outside. The mothers lay still, their eyes half closed, their ears twitching whenever the wind sighed through the branches. They dreamed of small hearts beating fast and bright, of tiny mouths searching for milk, of warmth that once filled the den like sunlight. The Alpha lay apart from them, his gaze fixed on the pale horizon. He watched the forest, waiting for movement, waiting for sound, waiting for the impossible line far away beyond the river's frozen skin. Something did move, faint and small against the endless white, but the pack did not see it, not yet. They only felt a stirring in the air, a shift in the stillness, like the world itself drawing breath before it spoke again. The wind had softened, but the cold remained a living thing, biting through fur and skin alike. The alpha stood at the edge of the den, his claws scraping against the frozen earth. Each movement tore at the soil beneath him, revealing nothing but ice and roots. He clawed again and again, as if the earth itself held the cubs hidden beneath its bones. Each scrape sent shards of frost into the air, and carried the hollow sound of loss into the sky. He did not feel exhaustion. He did not feel hunger, only the ache of absence. The weight of the missing. The mothers circled him low to the ground, their bodies tense, ready to defend or flee. Their ears flicked at every snap of branch, every whisper of snow falling from the trees. They did not speak in words, but their growls and whimpers formed a chorus of fear and hope and longing. They watched as he dug, and they remembered the first day the cubs had been born, small, wet, and trembling under the heat of their bodies. They remembered their cries and the warmth of small paws pressing against fur, and now they remembered loss and the emptiness of cold silence. A distant shadow crossed the snow, and the alpha froze, his claws half buried in frost, his eyes narrowed and his ears lifted. A shape moved against the wind, something small, fleeting, nearly invisible against the pale world. His heart slammed in his chest, and the mothers froze to their tails, stiffed their eyes wide. The shadow disappeared behind a drift, and he ran forward, following it, his paws cutting through the deep snow. Each step was a thunderclap in the silence. He reached the edge of the forest, where the trees opened onto a frozen river. The ice reflected the pale light of the sky, and stretched white and endless. He stopped, his nose twitched. The wind brought a faint scent, something alive, something human, something impossible. His claws scraped the ice, and he let out a low growl that turned into a howl of warning and hope at once. The mothers arrived, panting behind him, their bodies pressed close against the cold. They looked to him for guidance, their eyes bright with fear and longing. The air shivered with tension. The forest seemed to hold its breath. He sniffed the wind again, and caught at the faintest trace of warmth, the scent of life against the cold. He dug at the edge of the river, not caring for frost or pain or the weight of despair. His mind focused only on the memory of small faces and soft fur, and the hope that they were still out there, waiting. The mothers pressed closer, their noses to the ground, their paws scratching and scraping and whining. The sun attempted to rise behind the clouds, but the light was weak and gray. The world seemed paused between night and day, frozen and fragile and uncertain. Yet the alpha continued to claw at the ice and soil, driven by something older than hunger, older than fear, older than pain. The stirring of the impossible was close now, closer than he dared to believe. The forest grew darker as the sun sank behind the mountains, leaving only gray shadows and the cold bite of evening. The snow under the trees glimmered faintly, pale and sharp. The pack moved slowly among the trunks, their paws pressing into the frozen ground. Every step was cautious, every breath measured. The mothers stayed close to the den, their ears twitching at every distant crack of ice or snapping branch. They were restless but weary, their bodies heavy with hunger and grief. Every howl and whimper seemed swallowed by the wind before it could reach any ears. The alpha led the way, circling the den once more, his claws scraping the ice as if it could unearth the impossible. His eyes scanned the horizon for movement, anything that might break the frozen stillness. He could smell only the cold and the faint echoes of the cubs that lingered in the earth. His body trembled from the cold, but the ache in his chest burned hotter than any frost. He could feel the mothers watching him, their trust pressed into him like a weight he could not refuse. He could not fail them, not now, not ever. A gust of wind shifted the snow and carried something unfamiliar to his nose. Not the scent of predator, not the scent of scavenger, something different, something human. It was faint, fragile, but unmistakable. He froze, every muscle in his body tensed like a spring ready to snap. The mother stiffened behind him. The air seemed to pause, holding its breath with the pack. His head tilted slightly to catch the scent again. It lingered, then vanished, carried away by the cold breath of the forest. He growled low in his throat, a warning and a question at once. The pack moved forward together, slow, deliberate, cautious. The alpha sniffed the ground, moving toward the scent, and felt a flicker of hope flare in his chest. Could it be? Could it truly be something alive, something carrying what they had lost? The mothers' tails flicked uncertainly, their paws scraping the snow with quiet urgency. Every sound was magnified, the distant fall of a branch, a flutter of wings overhead. the faint crack of ice along the river's edge. Each one made the alpha lift his head and strain his ears. Searching, searching, searching. The night deepened and the gray light grew. Thin shadows wrapped around the trunks of the trees like fingers. The cold pressed harder against fur and bone, but still the pack moved, following the scent of something impossible and fragile, something that could not exist in this frozen world yet. Did the alpha's heart thumped so hard it rattled in his chest with hope and fear and longing. Every instinct in him told him to run to it, to protect it, to claim it, but he moved carefully, waiting for confirmation of life before rushing headlong into the unknown. And then, faint against the wind, there was movement just beyond the reach of sight. Something small, swaying like a shadow, something human. The alpha froze, his claws sinking into the snow, his eyes wide in disbelief. The mothers huddled closer, their whines low and uncertain. The forest held its breath, the night waited, everything waited. That force. His ears pricked and his eyes sharp as knives, slicing through the gray shadows. Every hair on his body lifted. In warning, the mothers pressed close behind him, their paws barely touching the frozen ground, as if the forest itself might shatter under their weight. The wind shifted and carried a new scent, something strange and raw and impossibly alive. His heart hammered faster than the snow falling around them. The pack had learned to fear everything in the forest, yet this was different. It was hope itself, and he could smell it lingering in the frozen air from behind a cluster of frost-laden trees. A movement appeared, slight and staggering. At first, a figure swayed against the wind, hunched low, as though the cold itself bent its spine. The alpha tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. The scent became stronger, human and warm, and carrying the faintest trace of blood and life. His muscles coiled instinctively. The mothers let out low growls, a mixture of warning and awe. They had not seen a human in months, not since the last hunt before the storm had claimed everything, and yet here, it was walking into the snow as if it belonged to neither the forest nor the storm. The figure stepped closer. Its arms were full of something, small shapes that twitched and moved. Against the cold frost clung to its hair, to its shoulders, to the edges of its clothing. Each breath it exhaled clouded like smoke in the frozen air. The alpha lowered his head almost to the ground, sniffing. It smelled alive. The pack stiffened around him, tails pressed low, their eyes wide. Could this human really carry what they had lost? Could it be possible that life had survived where the storm had tried to take everything? The figure staggered again, a hand brushing frost from its face, revealing pale skin red from cold, and eyes wide and wild. The alpha let out a low growl that rolled through the forest like distant thunder. The human froze mid-step. The cubs in its arms wriggled softly, their tiny cries almost drowned by the wind. And then the alpha felt it, the unmistakable heartbeat of what he had been searching for. Alive, small, warm, alive. The mothers moved closer, sniffing the air, as if confirming the impossible. Their whines were soft, low, trembling notes that spoke of fear and hope intertwined. The alpha stepped forward slowly, every muscle taut, every sense on fire. The human stumbled forward, dragging a foot through the snow, leaving a trail that glittered like silver in the fading light. The cubs shifted in her arms, letting out small cries of life that pierced the heart of every wolf. Watching, something in the air changed. The forest seemed to exhale. The alpha paused a few steps away, his chest heaving. He stared at the human, at the frost, at the cubs, at the impossible miracle she carried, and then he lowered his head slowly, almost reverently. The mothers pressed close beside him, their bodies trembling not from cold but from awe and relief, and the echo of grief that had held them for so long. The human lifted her head, and the alpha saw her eyes meet his, and something unspoken passed between them, something ancient and real and raw and miraculous. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the human stumbled forward through the snow, her arms tight around the small shapes that squirmed and whispered against her warmth. Each step left a trail of disturbed powder that glittered faintly in the dim light of dusk. The alpha followed cautiously, a few paces behind the mothers, circling the clearing like ghosts in fur and frost, every muscle in his body tense, every sense alert to the slightest movement, the smallest sound. The air hummed with the tension of disbelief and hope and something older than memory. The cubs stirred in her arms, small paws pressing against her chest and neck, their tiny faces bright against the pale frost covering her shoulders and hair. Their cries were weak at first, soft, almost lost to the wind, but then stronger, as if sensing safety. The alpha lowered his head further, his ears forward. He could smell warmth and life, and the unmistakable scent of his young. He did not understand how the cubs had survived the storm, the frozen river, the endless white, but the scent was proof enough, proof that life had endured. Against every impossible chance, the mothers pressed closer, stepping around. The alpha, their tails low, their bodies quivering with emotion that had nothing to do with cold. They sniffed the air around the human, trying to understand this creature that carried what they had mourned and lost. Their whines rose in soft chorus, low and trembling like wind through ice. The human faltered again, almost falling forward, but her hands clutched tighter around the cubs, pulling them closer to her chest. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, clouds of mist curling into the sky. She lifted her face toward the alpha and the mothers, and something in her eyes caught the pale light of the forest and shone. The alpha stepped forward slowly, each paw pressing firmly into the snow. His muscles tensed, ready to strike, ready to protect, ready to claim. He sniffed the air between them. The human smelled strange, not like the wolves, and not like the forest, and not like prey. She smelled of warmth, of determination, of fear and hope, and something sacred that stirred something deep inside him. The cubs wriggled and chirped in response to his presence, and he froze. Mid-step, heart hammering. Alive, 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 he thought. Alive. The human lowered her arms slightly, lifting one cub closer to her face, murmuring something he could not hear. The frost glimmered on her hair like shards of ice, reflecting the dim gray light, and the cubs blinked up at her, eyes wide with recognition and trust. The mothers moved closer, nudging her with gentle sniffs, circling her feet as if confirming the reality of the miracle. The alpha watched, silent and tense, his ears flicking from her face to her arms to the cubs. He had felt the world grow empty and cold and endless, but now there was proof that life could return, proof that the impossible could walk out of the snow and into their waiting. The wind shifted again, carrying the faint smell of river and earth and survival. The human stumbled forward one more step, placing her feet firmly in the snow, the cubs wriggling in response. The alpha lowered his head all the way now, almost touching the snow between them, in respect and awe. The mothers leaned closer, their bodies pressing toward her warmth and her miracle, and for a long moment, the forest seemed to pause, listening to the sound of hearts beating in unison, the miracle of return, the fragile promise of life. The alpha circled slowly just a few paces away, his body tensed but no longer ready to strike. The mothers pressed close around him, their bodies quivering like reeds in the cold wind. The human sank slightly to her knees, letting the cubs shift in. Her arms, one by one, she lowered them toward the snow. The cubs wriggled and chirped softly, their tiny voices trembling in the frozen air. The frost on her shoulders melted in places from the warmth radiating from their small bodies. Every movement was deliberate, careful, filled with a reverence born of exhaustion and hope. The alpha watched the first cub touch the snow, its paws sinking into the powder. For a heartbeat he froze, unable to move. Then the tiny shape turned its head, sniffed the air and lifted its small muzzle. Toward him its cry was weak, but unmistakable, a note of recognition that ripped through the frozen forest. The mothers leaned closer, noses extended, sniffing. The cubs, their whines rose in a trembling chorus of relief and disbelief. The cub was alive, alive and warm, and real. Another cub followed, sliding gently from her arms. It stumbled once in the snow, and then pressed close to the first. The alpha lowered his head further, his eyes locking onto them. He could feel the rhythm of their tiny hearts, and it sent something wild and ancient surging through his chest. He stepped closer, paw by paw, careful not to startle them. The mothers flanked him, sniffing and nudging the cubs as they began to move cautiously toward their parents. Each step was careful, deliberate, filled with awe at the miracle of survival. The human rose slowly, letting the last cub slide from her arms. She placed it gently beside its siblings, and stepped back. Her frost-covered hair clung to her face, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The alpha watched her for a long moment, sensing the exhaustion and determination that had carried her through snow and storm and frozen rivers. Then he looked down at the cubs, and a low growl rolled through his throat, a sound that was not threat or warning but something older and deeper, recognition and relief, and an echo of grief, fading into joy. The mothers pressed forward, nudging the cubs with gentle touches, their tails brushing against the alpha flanks. The cubs wobbled in the snow but began to settle, pressing close to each other. Tiny noses sniffed familiar fur, tiny eyes blinked against the pale light. The alpha lowered himself further, resting his head near the cubs, their warmth seeping into him. The human stepped closer slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile moment. She brushed a hand lightly over one of the cubs, and smiled, despite the frost and exhaustion. For the first time in days, the forest seemed to exhale, the winds softened. The snow around them no longer seemed hostile. The pack circled the cubs, their bodies a living shield of fur and warmth. The alpha's eyes met the humans again, and in that moment the impossible felt natural. The cubs were alive, and the miracle had walked through the storm and returned to them. The alpha lingered close to the cubs, his chest heaving, his ears flicking toward every sound in the frozen clearing. The human stood a step back, her hands still raised slightly, as if to protect herself, but her eyes soft and unafraid. The frost on her shoulders glimmered faintly in the dim light, and tiny beads of melting snow clung to her hair. The mothers circled the cubs, sniffing their fur, their tails low, but relaxed. Their eyes watched her with cautious curiosity, their whines quiet now, replaced by low murmurs of recognition and relief. Every movement was deliberate, careful, testing the boundaries of this fragile reunion. The alpha took a slow step forward, sniffing the air between the human and the cubs. His nose twitched, catching the warmth of her skin, the faint scent of human sweat and blood, and the unmistakable smell of care and determination. He lowered his head slowly closer to the cubs, nudging one gently with his muzzle. The cub stumbled slightly but stayed on its paws, its tiny tail flicking nervously. The mothers pressed closer to the alpha, forming a tight semicircle around the human and the cubs, their bodies radiating warmth and protection. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next movement. The human knelt slowly, bringing her hands down to rest lightly on the snow in front of the cubs. She exhaled softly, letting out a breath that trembled with relief and awe. One of the mothers sniffed her hand curiously, then pressed her nose lightly against her palm, testing her scent. The alpha watched intently, muscles coiled but unmoving. The cub chirped softly and pressed against the mother for reassurance. The human's fingers trembled as she reached forward, slowly brushing lightly over the cub's fur, letting them feel her presence without fear. The wolves sniffed again, nudged again, accepting the connection in their own cautious way. The alpha stepped fully into the circle, sniffing the edge of her clothing and the warmth radiating from her body. The cubs squeaked softly and pressed close to him. His eyes met hers briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. A silent recognition that she had carried what was most precious through the storm and brought it home. The mothers pressed even closer, their bodies brushing against hers, almost protective, almost trusting. The wind softened in the trees, and the clearing seemed smaller, warmer, quieter, as if the forest itself had bent to witness the moment. Time slowed as the alpha allowed her to remain near the cubs, her presence no longer a threat but a fragile bridge between species, between miracle and survival. The mothers rested their heads near her knees, sniffing lightly. The cubs began to explore the circle slowly, their tiny paws pressing into snow and fur. The alpha nudged one gently toward her, and it sniffed her fingers, then bounded back to its mother. Each gesture was careful, deliberate, a test of trust and connection. The frost on her hair began to melt in the warmth radiating from the pack and the cubs, and for the first time in days the forest seemed to hold its breath, not in mourning but in reverent witness of life. Returned. The clearing lay silent, except for the soft panting of the wolves and the tiny cries of the cubs. The alpha moved closer to the human, his powerful frame bending low to match the smallness of the creatures she had carried through the storm. He sniffed her arms and shoulders, his breath warm in the frozen air. The cubs wriggled in response, their tiny noses nudging against her fingers and her sleeves. She held them close, instinctively pressing her body gently against the alpha's chest, as if to anchor herself in the miracle unfolding before her. Eyes. The mothers pressed even closer around the circle, forming a living shield of fur and warmth. Their eyes watched the human intently, their ears flicking at every breath, every heartbeat. The cubs began to move between her and the alpha, testing their boundaries, exploring the safety of returned life. A low growl rumbled in the alpha's throat, not of warning but of possession and relief. The forest seemed to pause for the moment, as if holding its breath with them. The snowflakes drifting slowly down and melting against fur and skin, and Frost the human knelt fully, now letting the cubs crawl against the snow, her hands brushing over the alpha's muzzle and the mother's shoulders. She whispered words that no one else could hear, words of relief, of love, of disbelief and gratitude. Her breath came in white clouds, and the frost melted from her hair and clothes in tiny rivulets. She was part of this circle now, a fragile and honored presence who had walked through the storm and brought life back to the pack. The cubs chirped and squeaked, their tiny voices blending with the low murmurs of the mothers and the soft growls of the alpha. They tumbled over each other, exploring paws and tails and faces. One brave cub stumbled toward the human and pressed its small body against her chest, lifting a tiny head toward her face. She laughed softly, a sound like wind over ice, and pressed her forehead to its small head. The alpha stepped forward, letting the cub brush against him, and he lowered his head to meet hers, as if acknowledging the impossible journey she had taken. The mothers pressed closer, nudging the remaining cubs gently toward her, and each movement carried trust and awe. Their whines were soft, tremulous notes like a hymn of survival and reunion. The human's hands brushed over their fur, and she laughed and wept. At once, her eyes glimmering with tears that reflected the pale light of the frozen forest. The snow around them seemed to soften, melting slightly at the warmth of life returned. Every breath, every step, every movement carried the weight of grief lifted and hope restored. The alpha finally lifted his head, fully meeting hers with eyes that held the depth of centuries of survival and loss and triumph. He stepped back a pace, allowing her space yet never leaving her side. The mothers relaxed their bodies fully, their tails brushing gently against her legs as if claiming her as part of the circle. The cubs tumbled, happily exploring warmth and fur and love, and the forest seemed to lean closer to witness the miracle of retund. In that quiet frozen clearing, with snow falling softly around them, and the wind softened into silence, the pack and the human and the cubs stood together, alive, whole and unbroken, their hearts beating in a fragile chorus of survival, of reunion and of wonder that life could endure even through the coldest storms.